Welcome to Module 11. We're focusing on the westward expansion, the geographical expansion of the United States, the spread and the growth of the institution of slavery, and the threat to Native Americans, the policies of Indian removal. We're going to see the way that these three themes are interconnected and interdependent. So let's start by situating ourselves back around 1800, when last we met, Jefferson had just won the contested election of 1800. And let's talk about Jefferson's perspective on land and what this nation should be, and how that impacted his policies of Indian removal, as well as how his ideals don't quite come to fruition in the early 1800s. So Jefferson believed that America should become a nation of small farmers. He believed that that issue of property qualifications for voting could be set aside if people were given the opportunity to own property. And he believed that that's how this country would be instilled with civic virtue, that we would have a nation of small farmers. And you can see here this quote. He says, "Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God." Of course, he's a deist. I should have included the rest of the quote where he says, if God has a chosen people, right? Now, when he's talking about people who labor in the earth, he's not talking about the people that he's enslaved to labor on his plantation Monticello. He is talking about small farmers. He himself is not a small farmer. He's a planter. That's different. But in the 1770s and the 1780s, he advocates for this nation of small farmers. His policies, though, in the early 1800s and the policies of those that followed him do not match. What we don't see when Jefferson's president or later is a sincere effort to create a nation of small farmers. Now, the number of small farms continues to grow in America, but the idea that most of Americans, a high percentage of Americans, would be small farmers never comes to fruition, and especially doesn't come to fruition in the South. Small farmers are a minority in terms of land that they own, in terms of economic security, in terms of political power in the South. Small farmers are on the margins. It's planters that come to dominate, especially in the South. All right. So why do planters come to dominate in the South? And why do they continually need more land? So that's one of the stories of the first half of the 1800s. Planters, those huge hundreds of acres, growing for to take a crop to market. This is a profitable enterprise. This isn't a small family farm. These planters come to dominate the South, and they continually need more land. Why? Is it that there's so many of them? Not so much. It's the way that they treat the land, the way that that style of agriculture, what it does to the land. Let's look again to Thomas Jefferson, and we can see in a letter in the 1790s, he's writing to a fellow Enlightenment thinker, someone who's a scientist, knows a lot about agriculture, and he says, "We can buy an acre of land cheaper than we can manure an old one." And you see here later in the mid 1800s, another planter says, "It is positively bad economy for the Virginia planter," remember that's the enslaver, big plantation, "to undertake the improvement of his estate. It is more profitable to emigrate with his slaves to Mississippi and Louisiana, and there employ their labor in raising cotton and killing land, than to attempt the improvement of the worn lands at home." This gives you a hint of what's happening to that land. It's being killed. Monocrop, no crop rotation. They're not letting lands lie fallow. They are farming this land first to grow tobacco, then to grow cotton until it gives out. So these planters need to continually move south and west, acquiring new lands to create new plantations. But how could it possibly be cheaper to buy an acre of land than to take care of the acre of land that you have? How could that possibly be true? It's only true if more and more land becomes continually available because the federal government secures it, the federal government creates a policy of removing the people on the land, Indian removal, pushes west, and sells it to you cheaply. That's the only way that land is cheaper to buy new than to take care of what you have. In the first half of the 1800s, what we see is the expansion, not only from pushing Native Americans off their land, the expansion of the Louisiana Purchase is going to make that land cheap for planters. Because remember, when Congress sells you land, it's that big 640 acre chunk. You can buy it for $1 an acre, but you have to buy a big chunk of it. This will be a boon to planters in the South, especially. Now, we're really focusing a lot on the South today because we're also talking about the expansion of slavery. All right. You know a little bit about the Louisiana Purchase. You know that, oh, you may not know this part. Thomas Jefferson wanted the port of New Orleans. That's all he wanted. He wanted a way to use the Ohio River Valley, link up with the Mississippi, get the goods to market. The Louisiana is now back in the hands of the French. So the Spanish lost a whole bunch of this in the 7 Years' War. And Napoleon, the leader, little mini king, little dictator who took over after the French Revolution, Napoleon doesn't need the port of New Orleans anymore because he has lost Haiti. Haiti, the largest and most successful slave uprising in modern history, have thrown off the French. Napoleon's been defeated in Haiti by Toussaint Louverture, and he doesn't need the port of New Orleans anymore because he's lost Haiti. So Jefferson sends an envoy over to France to purchase the port of New Orleans. Now, Jefferson, when he's Adams' vice president, is a strict constitutionalist. That's an excellent position when you want to criticize your own president as VP. But as president, that turns a little more gray for him. Now, Jefferson acknowledges publicly and privately, I don't think the Constitution gives the office of the presidency the right to buy territory from a foreign country, but I really need the port of New Orleans. So he sends the envoy over. The envoy says, or Napoleon says to the envoy, yeah, I'll sell you the port of New Orleans, but you have to take the whole thing. You have to take all of this. That's the only way I'm going to sell you the port of New Orleans. And I'll sell this entire millions of acres for $15 million. The envoy says, well, nobody has $15 million. We'll write you an IOU. And I hope Jefferson's not too mad when we get back. The news beats them. Jefferson knows by the time they get back what's happened. And again, he says, I know that I didn't have the constitutional authority to do this, but dang, really needed the port of New Orleans. And now I have just doubled the size of the country. You know, of course, that this land was claimed by the French, but it was not held by the French. You know that it is full of Plains Indians and others. All right. What does he do with this Louisiana Purchase? Well, he doesn't know what's in it. Napoleon didn't know what's in it because they don't control it. You know, of course, that he sends Lewis and Clark on an expedition led by Sacagawea. Sacagawea was a Lemhi Shoshone woman. This is not a photograph of her. We're still before photographs, but I wanted to show you a picture of a later Shoshone woman so that you could see what it probably looked like when Sacagawea carried her baby. So Sacagawea, she's one of the interpreters and guides of the expedition, and she is on the expedition with her baby. She was part of the expedition when she was 16 years old. Sacagawea, of course, she's a heroine of American history. She has a really troubling story. She has a really troubling personal history. In 1800, when she was about 12, she and several other girls were kidnapped by a group of Hidatsa Indians in a battle that resulted in the death of several Shoshone. She was held captive at a Hidatsa village, and there, at about the age of 13, she was sold into a non-consensual marriage with a Quebecois, a French trapper. So the son is her son with this non-consensual marriage that she was sold into. So this may be reminding you a little bit of Mallinson. All right. This geographical expansion is going to be part of the story of the next couple of modules of the growth, the expansion of slavery, and the continual fight over slavery. That fight is going to become more and more contentious because now the country has to decide all of this new land, will it be free or will it be slave? That's going to be increased after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. All of this land, is it going to be free or is it going to be slave? Slavery is growing. Now, we have good reason to believe that the signers of the drafters of the Constitution, even those that were enslavers themselves, likely believed that slavery was waning, was on its way out. Tobacco was becoming less and less profitable. Slavery was obviously, even to them, in contradiction to the ideals of the new country. And they believed that ultimately the ending of the transatlantic slave trade would probably be the death blow of slavery. But what we see after the closing of the transatlantic slave trade in 1808 is a continual expansion of slavery. Why? What causes slavery or allows the institution of slavery to continue to grow? Of course, this isn't a natural mechanism growing it, right? This is people making choices to expand the institution of slavery, as well as some larger economic forces that are making that option available to them. What do I mean? The land, that's at the heart of it. Slavery is not going, the institution of slavery is not going to expand if there's not cheap land, as our enslaver told us, cheap lands to pick up and buy and move your plantation west. So that cheap land is one of the contributing factors to the expansion of slavery. The internal slave trade that takes the place of the transatlantic slave trade is why slavery continues to expand. One of the reasons that in place of importing human beings from directly from Africa, but mostly from the West Indies as that part of that Middle Passage, instead we have this internal slave trade and a black market. There are still illegal slave ships. And a new crop, cotton. Cotton had never been profitable for two reasons. One, there's no market for it before the 1800s. Nobody's buying cotton. They're like, what's that? We don't want to do anything with that. And part of the process of getting cotton to market was picking apart the cotton boll. So picking the little prickly parts from the soft cottony parts. Now, before the 1800s, that task was usually done by enslaved children in the South, but it's not, that slows the process down to such an extent that it's not going to be profitable to sell that cotton. Eli Whitney's cotton gin in 1794, a simple machine that you can see here that's designed to pull that cotton apart to take place of that fiddly bits that enslaved children would do. That suddenly opened up cotton. That middle part of the process is gone. And there are new markets emerging in the North, new textile mills as a result of the Industrial Revolution in the North. There's a market now. The South can send that cotton up to the North to be turned into textiles by textile mills. So keep in mind, even as the country is going to become more and more divided over the issue of slavery, keep in mind that the North is economically complicit in the institution, that slavery doesn't expand if there isn't a market for cotton in the North. And you can see here the expansion of cotton. It's moving west into some of the new lands opened up by the Louisiana Purchase. You can see here it's moving into areas of Georgia that had been held by the Cherokee Nation. So part of the story is purchasing cheap land. Part of the story is removing the people that already lived there and removing Native Americans who had for decades assimilated into American economy, American religious life, American culture. Let's talk about some of that assimilation. And we'll use the example of the Cherokee. This is a painting of John Ross, the Cherokee leader. This is not a candid shot. He sat down for this portrait. This is how he wanted himself to be. This is how he wanted to be portrayed. And you can see, and John Ross has a white father, and you can see that John Ross is portraying himself as every bit an elite American. that has American style dress. He has two documents, one that's written in English, one that's written in the Cherokee language. And he's chosen to present himself this way. The Cherokee by the 1830s had been held up for decades, beginning before Jefferson and into the 1830s. They had been held up as one of the five, quote, civilized tribes. And what did it mean in the South to be, quote, civilized? It meant dressing like John Ross, speaking English, having English schools, creating a newspaper, creating a constitution for the Cherokee Nation based off of the US Constitution. And in the South, being American, being, quote, civilized in the South included enslaving people of African descent. So a small amounts, just like among white Southerners, a small amount of Cherokee, the elite Cherokee, enslaved people of African descent. Now, I don't want to get too in the weeds of like, oh, some slavery is better than others. I don't want to get in the weeds there, but I do want to note that the Cherokee practices of slavery were different in subtle but significant ways, that they did incorporate some of the older Native American traditions of bonded labor. So for instance, you were more likely, if you were enslaved in the Cherokee Nation, it was more likely that your children would be free, that you would be able to purchase your own freedom. So it looked more like 1600s, where there was still that path to freedom. By the 1800s, for enslaved people in the American South, that path to freedom is really closing. So the Cherokee are subtly different, but we want to understand that part of being, quote, civilized in the American South is enslaving others. John Ross is a model of assimilation. He believes, because Jefferson tells him, the way forward for your people is to be like us. Assimilate into American culture and you will survive. Now, of course, there were other reactions or there were other paths. We've seen some of them with Pontiac. Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa between 1800 and 1812 were the other, the rejection of assimilation, the resistance, much more militant. They were part of this age of prophecy. We're still moving towards the Great Awakening here because we haven't moved forward in history. Tenskwatawa, this prophet, argued that white Americans were the source of all evil and that Native Americans should separate from them completely. In 1810, Tecumseh organized attacks on frontier settlements, but William Henry Harrison, in Tecumseh's absence in 1811, destroyed his village at the Battle of Tippecanoe in present-day Indiana. One of the things that I wanted to stress then is Native American Indian removal doesn't begin with Andrew Jackson, but Andrew Jackson becomes the main driver of a new wave of removal policies. And hold on, I'm gonna pause this for just a second. Sorry, there's some loud stuff in my house. All right, so Jackson doesn't invent Native American Indian removal, but he becomes the main agent of Indian removal of the 1830s, including ultimately the infamous Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears happens after his presidency, but as a result of his 1830 Indian Removal Act. Jackson, as president, benefits from an expanding electorate, an information revolution, and new sensationalism in press and politics. He's a new kind of president. If we compare a painting of his inauguration, let me get my laser pointer. Jackson's inauguration compared to Washington's, you see that Washington's inauguration in Philadelphia at the time he's surrounded by that small band of colonial elites, the electors who are responsible for electing him. Whereas Jackson, we see depicted here with all kinds of people celebrating his inauguration. Jackson sells himself and is elected as a man of the people. He's often called America's first populist president. And like I said, he's the benefit of changes in culture. Now, the basis of political democracy in this period is the challenge to property qualifications. So one of the things that he is going to benefit from is more people can vote after 1800. The expansion of who can vote is continuous. So we see just in raw numbers and in percentages, as property qualifications are removed. No state after the original 13 had property qualifications. Rhode Island, there was a war fought over universal suffrage for white men, the Dorr War. By 1840, so a little bit after Jackson, by 1840, more than 90% of adult white men could vote. This is an expansion of the electorate. But it's not equally applied. We saw in New Jersey that, remember, women with property could vote until 1807. Property qualifications kept the electorate small, but they created spaces where in New Jersey, women could vote. In other states, African Americans could vote based on property qualifications. And those people lost the right to vote as property qualifications were removed. So in the place of property qualifications, which largely served to make a white male electorate, because who owned property? Mostly white men. But when those property qualifications were removed, what was put in their place were explicit voting laws that said it's free white men who can vote. So property qualifications are removed, which allows more white men to vote, poor white men especially, but some people are going to lose that right to vote. We tend to think of voting rights as a nice continual line from 1776 all the way up to us, continually expanding. That line is a lot more rockier than you might imagine. Jackson's also the benefit of an information revolution. Now, this like, we've got the internet. We're like, what's that? It's a steam-powered printing press, which is going to make printing newspapers cheap and fast. And you're going to see the rise of alternate presses. Here we have the Cherokee Phoenix, the Liberator. We're going to look a lot at William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist newspaper. We also see these penny presses, what are called the flash press. Presses aimed at single young men with a little bit of money, especially in cities like New York. And you could see here that they would print salacious cartoons where, like, oh, you could see the outline of a lady's thigh, or, oh, a lady's fallen over and I can see her legs. These penny presses, though, also drove the press in America to be more sensationalist. So as these penny presses competed with each other for readership, they began to run more and more sensationalist articles. And then older, more established, maybe more respectable newspapers also became more sensationalistic to keep up so that they could keep selling newspapers as well. This is a depiction of the murder of Helen Jewett in 1836. This took hold of newspapers in New York and around the country. Every day it was more and more sensationalism about this murder and the trial of Richard P. Robinson, who probably murdered her. All right. Jackson's going to step right in. This is exactly what Jackson needs. Jackson needs white men, especially in the South, including white men who don't have property, to vote for him. He's going to rely on that sensationalism of the press. And you can see here, of course, like I said, he's the man of the people, the man who could not barter or bargain for the presidency because it should be derived from the people. This is how he presents himself. His opponents present Jackson as an out of control, bloodthirsty maniac. This is a poster describing some of the deaths that Jackson was responsible for. He executed soldiers in Florida. He went into Spanish Florida without authorization, ended up executing soldiers under his care. There was some, in his own time, there was some question about whether or not he was, that was a fair tribunal, that he was authorized to do that. He shot a man in the streets of Nashville. So this poster, this anti-Jackson campaign poster says, look at the bloody deeds of General Jackson. You can't vote for this maniac. His supporters, though, they were like, or that's why we're voting for him, right? This did not faze his supporters. Now, Jackson was another thin-skinned, he had a little bit of a thin skin like Adams, a little bit reactionary. He goes to war with the National Bank. I'm not going to get into the bank war, but it's actually very interesting. He has these paranoid beliefs that the bank is after him. His vice president, Van Buren, comes in to the Oval Office. Jackson's laying on the couch. Van Buren thinks he's dead. Like, that's how bad he looks. And Jackson wakes up, sits up, and says to Van Buren, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." He breaks up the First National Bank, gives all of that responsibility and money to pet banks, friends and his supporters, and creates a panic of 1837, leading to an economic depression. All right. What we're focusing is on Jackson's policy of Indian removal. You are going to read his speech to Congress. And what I want you to understand is that the Indian Removal Act of 1830 passes very narrowly. A lot of white people do not support it. Now, this is mostly Northerners because they know that this is going to expand slavery, for other reasons as well. Some of them are missionaries that have done work with these tribes. So many Northerners do not support this. Some white Southerners don't support it. Sam Houston, honorary Cherokee, his wife is a Cherokee woman. He does not support, he's a vocal, I've lost the word for not a supporter. He's a vocal critic of the Indian Removal Act. So Jackson has to come before Congress to make a speech to get this thing passed. And this primary source, usually we look at primary sources and we're looking at worldviews, biases. What's their limited perspective on this? What are they bringing into this that contributes to that perspective? The speech on Indian removal is a little bit different because there are elements of the speech that we know aren't true, and we know Jackson knows aren't true. Jackson describes Native Americans as wild savages, roaming forests without restraints, without towns, without economies. He describes them as these uncivilized people. He knows real Native Americans, though. He knows John Ross. John Ross fought under Jackson during the War of 1812. And anyone who's been to the Cherokee Nation, or anyone who's had dealings with the Cherokee, knows what their towns and cities are like. Let's watch about a minute of a video because I want you to see some of the elements of Cherokee life by the 1830s, and you're going to, or 1820s, I should say, and you're going to think about that as you read Jackson's speech. What is he knowingly misrepresenting? We know that he knew this wasn't true. So let me see if this works. That's always a fun game. Does this work? Looks good. Looks good so far. We're just going to watch the first minute. This is from the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian has a good YouTube channel.
For thousands of years, these mountains were home to the Cherokee, but they were just a small piece of their vast nation, which covered 40,000 square miles here in the Appalachian Mountains. In 1819, as more and more Americans started encroaching on Indian land, the U.S. government signed a treaty that guaranteed that Cherokee land would be off limits to white settlers forever. It clearly stated, all white people who have intruded or may hereafter intrude on the lands reserved for the Cherokees shall be removed by the United States. Confident that the U.S. government now recognized its sovereignty over its own lands, the Cherokee Nation proceeded to build itself a new capital in 1825, here in what's known as New Echota, Georgia. It had its own courthouse, council house, and post office, and even space for the first Indian language newspaper office in the nation.
All right, let me just, I'm not sharing my screen.